A continuación, invitamos al escenario al Dr. Mel Ydreos, Executive Director of Public Affairs International Gas Union, quien presentará la siguiente conferencia, La Revolución del Gas Natural. Bienvenido. Welcome.
Thank you. Buenos dias. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Delighted to be here on behalf of the International Gas Union. I want to thank Orlando for inviting us to be here. Orlando plays a very important role for the International Gas Union, as he's also the regional director for this region in the Caribbean, an important role. We have 6 of those regional directors, and they really are ears and eyes with respect to the region and giving us much better understanding and knowledge of the current issues and opportunities within each region. I bring greetings from President Joe Kung from Korea and our Secretary General Louise Bertrand, who I believe was here last year and spoke at this conference. Okay. Can you advance to the next slide? So what I'm going to try and do in the next 20-25 minutes is basically lift you away from Colombia and take you around the world and give you an idea of what's happening to the gas industry around the world. And I will bring it back to Colombia in some of my remarks. But what I'll do first is cover the developments in 2018 from the perspective of supply, price, infrastructure development, and all of that. I will then go ahead and talk a little bit about the IGU 2019 report that we released just last week in Shanghai, China, which is our annual LNG report. It is one of the most comprehensive reports that is out there with respect to the market developments around LNG. And I will talk a little bit about the major trends that we're seeing in LNG. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about security of supply and flexibility. As Colombia gets ready to embrace and bring in solar and wind, I'm going to talk a little bit about how gas and renewables work together to ensure stability, reliability of the system. And I'll give you some real examples. You're at a good stage because there's been a lot of developments with respect to renewable energies, and there's a lot of learnings out there that I think you should look for to ensure that as you develop the system, that you understand much better how the fuels interplay together and some of the challenges and opportunities between the synergy of those two fuels. And then finally, I will talk a little bit about transportation, particularly on CNG, LNG, and bunkering. As we're in a port, I think bunkering will become a very important feature, hopefully, of your port as we move forward, and it's a real opportunity from the perspective of LNG. So let me get going then and start my presentation and talk a little bit about demand and prices in 2018. Well, 2018, we ended up with some volatility in price. And price certainly was much higher than it was in 2017. So we saw a higher price in terms of spot prices in both Europe and Asia. But what's interesting is that while prices spiked in October, after October, the collapse began. And we're currently in a very collapsed price market with respect to LNG. The LNG spot price today is less than $5 an MCF. It is the lowest it's been for a long time. And in January of this year, we had the first phenomenon where the Asian spot for LNG was lower than the European spot. So what we saw then was all the cargoes that were heading towards Asia were redirected towards Europe. But it's also a sign that the market is starting to really work. We're starting to get into a global market where price signals dictate where the product will land. And I think it's still very early days with respect to having a total commodity, global commodity, but the signs are there and that's being developed. So very positive from that perspective, a bit worrisome that the price has collapsed, but there's good reasons for it. And it's something that we're going to have to look forward in the future. With China taking on so much LNG over the last 2 years, and what's happening is that they've had a very warm winter. So has Europe. So the northern hemisphere, if you exclude North America, which doesn't really influence global LNG prices, was warm, very warm. And therefore, the price collapsed because the demand wasn't there. And I think what we're going to have to look for in the future is the reality that the LNG curve will begin to change between seasons. Whereas right now, it's a pretty steady demand. I think as China draws more LNG, and it's in the northern hemisphere, its winter matches with the winter in Europe, we will see that the curve, the load curve, will change. And what does this mean? What's the implication of that? I think the implication is that ultimately, LNG will have to find a place somewhere in the summer. And this is where storage will become a very strategic asset. And I know our next speaker will talk about storage, so I'm setting it up a little bit for our next speaker, but it really will become a very strategic asset because you'll be able to leverage some low prices, I think, in the summer into storage for the winter peaking months. So the other phenomenon we saw, which again points to an issue that may evolve that we have to look out for, is that the LNG freight prices really spiked in 2018. And while the average is around $70,000 a day for freight, we had prices up to $195,000 a day in September and October. And it's really, that's your floating pipeline. So demand can only be met if you have sufficient pipeline capacity, or in this case, sufficient freight capacity. Where you don't have enough freight capacity, you're going to get spike increases. And it's important for the LNG industry that as that supply grows, that the floating pipeline always also grows hand in hand with it, or else you're going to get into constraints which are physical as opposed to supply. And then what happened is, LNG continues to go mostly in Asia, between South Korea, China, and Japan. Over 50% of the global LNG supply is consumed in those three countries. So very, very significant. And Chinese demand has really taken off over the last 2 years, aided by policy around clean skies. So we talked yesterday about the issue of urban air quality, and of course it's acute in Asia. It's something that China has decided to do something about it for the past several years, and that has meant the importation of a lot more LNG into the supply mix to see the air quality improvements that actually they're experiencing. Now let me talk about supply and infrastructure. Australia became the largest LNG exporter in the world, surpassing Qatar for the first time in a long time. And Prelude, which is the largest FLNG platform, became operational, even though not a single cargo has left Prelude yet. Even without that, the 7 other projects in Australia have begun to produce and have exceeded the capacity that Qatar puts to the market. Now, the other big story is the U.S. As we know, U.S. is becoming a significant LNG exporter, and it nearly doubled its capacity in 2018, and we expect that this year they will reach 60 megatons and become the third largest LNG exporter in the world, which is a phenomenal accomplishment, considering that not too long ago, the U.S. was planning to import natural gas. And of course, as we spoke again yesterday, unconventional resources, hydraulic fracturing, is what enabled the U.S. to become an LNG exporter. And here's the number. In the next 5 years, of all the incremental new LNG supply that will come to the market, 75% of it will come out of the U.S. It's a very significant number, and it'll have significant implications to the global LNG market, primarily because it's a destination-free LNG offering. And that in itself has already shifted the LNG business, that literally any new plant that goes out there, any new contract, removes the destination clause that was so restrictive in terms of options for the buyers of the LNG. I should mention Yamal was probably the accomplishment of the year. This is in Russia. It was the accomplishment of the year because Yamal came on stream at least 6 months earlier than anticipated and slightly less cost. And for this size of investment to come in ahead of schedule and at lower cost is a very significant accomplishment, something that'll be hard to repeat. But it's in full production now, 16.5 megatons of LNG. And what we're finding is that the assumptions were made with respect to how long it takes for Yamal LNG to Asia was actually very conservative. They can get the LNG to Asia in 7-8 days, which again gives you a lot of flexibility and responsiveness to the market. But let's not forget, there are also major pipeline projects that are under development that are going to come on stream, particularly in 2019. We expect to see Nord Stream 2, the very controversial pipeline that bypasses Ukraine, to actually come into completion. It's about a third done right now. Denmark is the only country that still has some issues that need to be sorted out. The other approvals have been received. We know that there are threats from the U.S. with respect to sanctions and all that stuff. Our position is the market should dictate, and we believe that this pipeline will be built this year and completed. Power Siberia, a very important pipeline into China, is expected to also be completed by the end of this year. And two other little projects, little by the scale of these other two, are TAP and TANAP. TANAP's finished. TAP is the southern corridor into Europe, into Greece and Italy. That's expected to be completed by 2020. About 10 BCM into Europe. So not a huge amount, but very important amount for the southern, eastern European countries. So very important from the perspective of diversity of supply. Now, we also know that in September, China slapped a 10% tariff on US LNG. This is part of the trade war that's going on between China and the US. And in retaliation, China imposed a 10% tariff on US LNG. Not a big deal at the moment because the actual volumes out of the US into China are still relatively small. And because they're destination clause free, China has been able to divert those cargoes and swap them for other cargoes, thus avoiding the 10% tariff. In fact, since September, only one cargo in January has landed in China from the US. Hopefully, we're hoping by the G20 ministers or a meeting in Japan that some sort of agreement will be reached between the US and China to resolve this issue and lift the tariff I think it's very important for both countries, China from the perspective of importation, and U.S. in terms of getting final investment approvals for some upcoming projects that are being considered. And then, of course, the biggest concern we've had over the last 3 or 4 years is that there were not sufficient FIDs taken with respect to new plants. In fact, none. And 2018 was a breakthrough year. We had the biggest announcement of an FID taken with the Canadian LNG plant in the west coast of Canada. And then a series of other ones followed early this year. So the fears that sort of existed that there would be a supply crunch come 2022, 2023, I think they're starting to go away. The market is responding, which is a very, very positive sign, because it is basically recognizing that the demand will be there for LNG. So let me move on into some of the details with respect to the World LNG report that we released last week. This is our most popular report. We released it last Wednesday, and today is what, Tuesday or Wednesday? Wednesday, a week ago. We've had over 1,000 downloads from our website. We typically get about 10,000 downloads of this report annually. It is free. You can get a report downloaded from igu.org/LNG, which is our microsite that we've built for the release of this report. We also have some additional reports there of interest. We have a short 2.5-minute video that describes the results and all of that. I mean, in short, basically, 2018 was a tremendous year for LNG. It was the 5th consecutive year of significant increased supply. 28.2 megatons of incremental supply came to the market, taking us over 300 megatons in total, 316.5. And it was really the 3rd largest single year increase of LNG into the market. We had 2 new members join the import of LNG club, as we call it, and there they are, Panama and Bangladesh were the 2 countries that became new. That takes us up to 37 countries now that import LNG. Now, you might see some other reports that say that there are 42 countries that import LNG, and actually, both of those numbers are accurate, and I'll just explain the difference so that you don't get confused. There are 5 countries that produce LNG and consume LNG inside their own country. From a perspective of global trade, we don't consider that in our numbers. So those 5 countries are not included in our numbers. Indonesia, for example, is one of those countries that produces LNG and consumes LNG without trading it outside of its borders. So for our purpose in our reporting, we don't include those 5 countries that don't really go out in the market and sell LNG to the market. So the 37 countries that I'm referring to actually buy LNG from the market and import it into their country. So that's sort of the difference. What you will see also on our website is a series of infographics that can be downloaded, that can be reused, which give you a snapshot of sort of where we're at in trade, in cargoes. As you can see, the bottom right here is all the statistics about the cargoes, how many new cargoes are being built, 51 I believe is the number, how many total cargoes are out there. We had just over 5,000 journeys in 2018 of deliveries of LNG. So it's about 10 per cargo is how it sort of works out. So you get about 10 trips per cargo in a year. That's how it sort of works. Now, growth in LNG does enhance security of supply. So I took a snapshot of December 2008. This is what the trade flows looked like 10 years ago. And then I compared that to December 2018. And you can see what's happening here. We're going much more diverse in terms of where the LNG is coming from, where it's going, where it's flowing. There's a lot of movement. Of course, as we get more supply, we'll have more routes, and the more liquid we get, the more we can move to a truly global market with respect to this commodity. Now, what's going to enhance trade security and enhance security of supply? Well, obviously, increases in the supply become very important. As we discussed yesterday, your ability to extract unconventionals in Colombia will become important because you may actually join the club of exporting. But sufficient supply of carrying vessels or cargoes, as I said before, it's the floating pipeline. They have to keep up with the increase in supply, or else you have a constraint. So that has to match. And on the downstream side, on the regas side, it's very important to have a robust infrastructure that can take the resource away and distribute it. And storage will become increasingly important. Now, small-scale LNG is beginning to be quite important because it allows you to move the product without the infrastructure. In China, for example, last year, there were over 1 million truck deliveries of LNG. So, because the infrastructure, large country, the infrastructure is not as yet developed, they are able to deliver the LNG by truck to all the locations and use it that way than building the infrastructure. The infrastructure ultimately will catch up, but with LNG trucking and movement of small-scale LNG, it allows you to use LNG while the infrastructure is built. Continue to develop the midstream secondary market, and flexibility of contracting becomes very important. The midstream secondary market is really the traders of LNG, the portfolio players that come in and have a portfolio of options and enter into the spot market and all that. That becomes very important. And then at the end of the day, policy is important. Prudent policy, long-term policy, becomes very important in growing security of supply. Now let me quickly go through the integration of renewables with natural gas and the important role and some of the lessons learned from around the world when it comes to that. To the left, what you're seeing there is the UK, and what you're seeing there is 5 years of demand of both electricity and heating on an equal converted basis to terawatt hours per day. And what you can see there is that the power demand is relatively flat. But as we know, the heating demand is not. So think through the implications of substituting heating to electrification, which is one of the most common talked about issues around the world, that ultimately we will electrify the downstream and combine that with renewables, and that's our way out of the carbon issue. Well, the reality is that to have renewables, to be able to respond to those kinds of load curves, you have to have a tremendous amount of capacity available. And then what do you do with it in the off cycles? What do you do with it when it's summer? Of course, this is where the thinking is that hydrogen, synthetic hydrogen, will be produced from renewables, but all of that has to all work out financially and economically, which is still yet to be proven. Now, the other thing we never talk about is cooling, and we're in a great place to talk about cooling. In Kuwait, in 2009, they had an issue keeping up with the cooling demand. So the blue line there shows you 10 years of temperatures in Kuwait. As you can see, Kuwait taps up at about 40 Celsius in the summer and drops to about a high of 15 in the winter. So what has been happening in Kuwait is that LNG has been coming into Kuwait, starting in 2009, and you can see the increase. You can see the curve, the way it's going up. It's becoming much more important in meeting the peak cooling demand. We'd normally talk about heating, but in reality, there is a cooling issue that has to be managed as well. And the other impressive thing that you see from this chart is the diversity of supply of LNG into Kuwait. It comes from the Atlantic Basin, the Middle East, and the Pacific Basin. And that level of diversity gives you and enhances security of supply. Now let's move over to two more charts very quickly. The first one on the left is Spain. Spain, as we know, has installed a significant amount of renewable resources. This is December 2017, a year ago or so, or a couple of years. And look what happened in December. Towards the end of December, wind was really good, and renewables came in and met most of the supply. But the first week in December, there was no wind. Even though with a very significant large renewables fleet available, gas had to save the day. And you can see how the blue line spiked in order to balance the system during that week. And if you didn't have that resource available to respond quickly, you would have had brownouts, you would have lost the system. So this is the role, the interplay between renewables and gas, because frankly, you go through spells of no wind. The UK earlier this year went through 3 weeks of sustained no wind conditions. And there's no battery in the world that's going to be able to supply sufficient response for that long. Batteries ultimately will become important, and they'll become important in meeting very short-term fluctuations, but when it comes to the longer term, they just simply will run out of juice and will not be what's going to save the system. So gas plays a very important role. And of course, Brazil, gas and FLNG has become a peak shaving fuel. When you have a drought, when you have a warm winter, LNG comes in, it gets imported, that's the red line, and the red line is power generation, and the blue line is how much LNG went into Brazil. So it plays this role as well. Now, there's one additional issue that I'd like to point out that as we learn more, as I said, becomes critical. This is a 300 megawatt power plant in the US. It happens to be a coal power plant, but it could be just as easily a gas power plant. The blue line is what this plant operated at before wind came in, before there was windmills in this area. And you can see it produced pretty steady around 300 megawatts per day. You can see that blue line pretty steady. Now what's happened ever since the wind has come in is that in reality this plant is chasing the wind to balance the system. And it balances it on a 5-minute increment, on an hourly increment, never mind a daily increment, because you get wind gusts, the production of electricity out of renewables is not steady. And therefore you need something that will keep the system balanced. And this plant is doing it, but look how it's doing it. It's going through up and down in a very, very significant way. It's ramping up, it's ramping down, it's responding to the system, trying to keep the system balanced. The problem with that is these plants were not designed to operate in this way. Yes, they have ramping capability, up and down, but not to this scale. So what you're getting into is some real thermal stresses being imposed on this plant that for all intents and purposes are not being compensated. These plants will have to undergo significant maintenance to keep up and extend their lives, but none of that is being compensated. And these are some of the lessons that we're learning that at least policymakers should be made aware of that it looks very simple, it looks very easy, but in reality, there are many, many implications in the way we integrate these systems. Now, very quickly, let me go to CNG, something we talked at length yesterday, and I congratulate you for being actual leaders in the CNG market. Globally, about 26.5 million vehicles, and for a market that's been around for as long as it has, it's actually not a very high number. However, of the 26.5 million, 3.5 million of those vehicles are in Iran. That's why that orange pie is so big. But what you see on the right-hand side is it's the ratio of CNG vehicles to fueling stations. And the highest in Europe is Italy, because Italy has the highest number of CNG vehicles. But it also points to the issue that infrastructure is needed to go hand in hand if you're going to develop the CNG market. Now, how does Colombia fare out? Very well. You know, you're at about 700 CNG vehicles per refueling station, which is excellent. And you're also above 2% of the global CNG market. Consider that all of Europe has 4.5% of the CNG market, and you right here in Colombia have over 2% of the global market. I think that's a pretty significant accomplishment, and you should be congratulated for that. Now let me move over to heavy-duty vehicles, because it is a big opportunity, and we're seeing significant growth in China, both in buses and heavy transport. You know, the numbers are small. You're seeing China, we're up to about 300 LNG fueled. Europe, when you look at Europe, from 2016 to 2018, in just 2 years, there's been a triple use of LNG fueled heavy trucks, from 1,500 to about 5,500. And there's a significant growth that's expected. Some 280,000 LNG trucks are expected to hit the road by 2030. So this is definitely a big, big opportunity and a big marketplace as we move to decarbonize heavy transport. Very quickly, Argentina just recently launched 6 LNG trucks. I think the range is around 1,100 kilometers, and they're able to deliver small quantities of LNG to the market, and these become virtual pipelines, which is again a very interesting development that we should look out for. And particularly relevant, I think, to Colombia as you try and get the 1 million people into a clean fuel from where they are right now. And then let me conclude by talking a little bit about shipping. The IMO new standard on low sulfur fuel comes in just, 8 months, 9 months from now. So what's happening? There are about 55,000 ships out there of all sorts. And it looks like currently the preferred route to compliance to the IMO standard will be scrubbers. Installing scrubbers on board that can use the fuel but scrub out the sulfur. Biggest issue is going to be, what do you do with what you scrub out? And most operators believe they will be dumping this into the ocean. What we're seeing now is ports putting policies into place that will not allow the dumping of the sulfur into the waters. So that's an interesting development. It's a big opportunity for LNG, but it's going to be a slow opportunity, primarily because the overall global fleet is still relatively young. The average age of those 55,000 vessels out there is about 15 years, and typically you get 20 to 25 years of life. The industry, it's in its longest downturn ever in history, so access to capital is an issue to install the necessary engines and change out. There is a capital cost issue, and scrubbers are cheaper right now than changing the engines. So what we're seeing here is even though there's some conversions going on, we believe the real market will evolve over the years as new ships come into play, and particularly cruise liners, because cruise liners carry people. They don't carry cargo. And I think what we're going to see is cruise liners will begin to move to LNG as a clean option, as a clean marketing option to their passengers. And we're starting to see that develop. And you've got a great opportunity here. You've got a plant. So creating LNG bunkering in your port right here, I think will be very important, because the cruise liners are going to go that way. We know that, and that's another policy decision I think the government should consider. So there's only 126 vessels right now in operation. 137 are in the books to be built. So it's growing. As I said, it'll be slow and steady growth throughout. And what we need is some regulatory decisions to be made. The largest issue is enabling credit access to to a sector that is having difficulty getting the necessary credit. And I believe it's over. Thank you so much.